Welcome. Find a comfortable position. Perhaps you're already in exactly the right position, the one you settled into a few minutes ago after trying one or two others and deciding this was the one. Perhaps the blanket is arranged correctly and the pillow is at the right angle and the room is the right temperature, or near enough to the right temperature that it has stopped requiring any thought. That is good. That is exactly right. There is nothing you need to do right now. There is nowhere you need to be. There is only this quiet story about something you are doing right now, something that human beings have been doing at the end of every single day for as long as there have been human beings doing anything at all, which is preparing for sleep. Before electricity, which means before roughly the 1880s in most of the world, the business of ending the day and preparing for sleep was a longer and more deliberate process than it tends to be now. It involved real fire and the careful management of real fire and the absence of all those sources of light and stimulation that we now have available to us right up to the moment we close our eyes. It involved a darkness that was genuinely dark, the kind of dark that modern people rarely experience. A thick and thorough dark that covered everything equally and made the world outside the small circle of a candle or a fire into a different kind of place entirely. And it involved a relationship with the rhythms of daylight and darkness that was much more direct and much more physical than the relationship most of us have with those rhythms now. This is a story about all of that, not about the famous people or the dramatic events, because those are not what we need tonight. Tonight we need the ordinary people in their ordinary houses at the end of their ordinary days, managing their fires and trimming their wicks and putting on their nightcaps and settling their children and pulling their curtains and lying down in beds that smelled of lavender or wood smoke or simply of the accumulated warmth of many nights of sleep, and closing their eyes in a darkness that was complete and final, and that meant, in a very direct and practical way, that the day was over. So let us begin. The fire is burning low. The candle is lit. There is no hurry at all. Chapter 1. The Nature of Darkness. Before electricity. Before we follow any particular household through its evening routine, it is worth spending a moment on the darkness itself, because the darkness of the pre-electric world was qualitatively different from the darkness we are familiar with, and appreciating this difference will make everything that follows a little more vivid and a little more interesting in the gentle and unhurried way that is appropriate for this hour. In a modern city or town, true darkness is almost impossible to find. The streetlights outside the window produce a glow that comes through curtains and around door, frames and under doors. The standby lights of electronic devices dot the room with small points of red and green and amber. The light from a phone or a clock face illuminates a corner. The collective glow of a city visible in the sky on cloudy nights. All of this means that even in a room with the curtains drawn and the lights off, there is a residual level of illumination that your eyes, once adjusted, can use to navigate by. Total darkness, the kind in which you genuinely cannot see your hand in front of your face, is not something most modern people encounter in their daily lives. Before electric lighting, the situation was entirely different. A room at night, with the fire out and the candle extinguished and the shutters closed, was genuinely dark in a way that had real physical consequences. Moving around in such darkness without a light was hazardous. You could not see the furniture, you could not see the door, you could not see the steps if there were steps. The darkness was not a slight dimming of the world, but a complete removal of the visual information that people rely on for everything they do when they are awake. This is one of the reasons that going to bed in the pre-electric world was a much more final act than it tends to be now. Once the light was out, that was it. You were in the dark, and in the dark you were going to stay until morning brought light back, or until you made the effort to relight something which had its own cost and complexity. The darkness outside was also more complete than anything we experience now. A village at night before electricity was genuinely dark. The only light would be whatever came from the windows of houses where fires or candles were still burning, and this light was small and local and did not reach far into the surrounding dark. Walking between houses at night required a lantern or a torch, and the person who went out without one was in genuine difficulty. The countryside beyond the village was darker still. A road at night without a moon was not merely dim, but effectively invisible, and the traveller who was not yet home by nightfall faced a real problem. This darkness shaped everything about the experience of bedtime in the pre-electric world. It shaped the timing of sleep, because the absence of light was a powerful signal to the body that the day was over. It shaped the rituals of the evening, which were largely organized around the management of light and the orderly reduction of that light toward darkness. And it shaped the quality of sleep itself, because the darkness was so complete and so consistent throughout the night, unmixed with the light pollution that modern sleepers experience, that the sleep it contained was different from the sleep we know, deeper in some respects and more directly tied to the natural rhythms of light and dark that the human body was shaped by over thousands of generations. All of this is worth keeping in mind as we move through the story that follows. Chapter 2: The Hours of the Day and When Sleep Came. In the pre-electric world, the relationship between daylight and the human day was much more direct than it is now. People rose near dawn when there was light enough to work, and they went to bed when the darkness made further activity impractical, which in the depths of winter could be as early as 7 or 8 in the evening. The length of the active day varied with the season, in a way that the modern experience of a consistent artificial light day does not, and this variation was simply accepted as the way things were rather than experienced as a problem to be solved. Historians who have studied sleep patterns in the pre-electric world have found evidence for a sleeping pattern that was quite different from the single consolidated block of sleep that most modern people think of as normal. In many accounts, from before the widespread adoption of electric lighting, people slept in 2 distinct periods, with a period of quiet wakefulness at the middle of the night between them. The first sleep, as it was called, would begin shortly after dark, perhaps around 9 or 10 in the evening, and would last for several hours. Then the sleeper would wake, naturally and without alarm, in the deep middle of the night. This period of waking might last for an hour or so. Then the second sleep would begin, and would continue until morning. During the period of waking between the 2 sleeps, people did various things. Some lay quietly in bed, thinking or praying. Some got up and did small tasks that required minimal light. Some visited neighbours, if the household was close enough. Some couples talked or were intimate. The physician Thomas Cogan, writing in the 16th century, recommended this middle-of-the-night waking period as a good time for scholarly reading, study and prayer, which suggests that it was recognised as a regular feature of the night and that there was established thinking about how best to use it. The concept of first sleep and second sleep is not in common use today, because the pattern itself is not common today. The introduction of artificial lighting, and particularly the introduction of gas lighting in the 19th century and electric lighting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, gradually shifted human sleep patterns toward the consolidated single sleep that we now consider normal. The ability to extend the active day into what would otherwise have been hours of darkness, to have light available for reading and socializing and working after dark, changed the timing and the nature of sleep in ways that were real and significant, and that happened gradually enough that nobody particularly noticed them happening. For the purposes of this story, what matters is that in the pre-electric world, the relationship between sleep and the night was different, closer and more direct, and the rituals of bedtime were correspondingly different, more deliberate, more laden with practical significance, and more embedded in the daily routine than the relatively casual relationship with sleep that many modern people have. Chapter 3. The Fire and its Management. The central technology of warmth and light in the pre-electric household was the fire, and the management of the fire was a significant part of the evening routine in most households across most of the pre-electric period. The fire needed to be managed carefully at the end of the day, both to preserve the fuel that had been gathered or purchased, and to prevent the serious and ever-present risk of fire spreading to the building in which it burned. The fireplace in most pre-modern European houses was the heart of the home in a very literal sense. It was where the cooking was done, or at least where the main cooking fire burned. It was where the household gathered in the evenings for warmth. It was the primary source of light in the room, and it was a fire, a real fire burning in a real building, and the responsibility for managing it safely was a genuine and daily responsibility. The evening management of the fire began with a decision about what the night required. If the household was wealthy enough to have fuel to spare, the fire might be kept going at a low level through the night, providing warmth and making it easier to restart the fire in the morning. If fuel was scarcer, the fire would be allowed to die down more completely. The coals raked and covered to keep them alive as long as possible, reducing to a red glow that might last through the night and be brought back to flame in the morning without the full work of relighting. If the household was very poor, the fire might be let out entirely and the work of relighting done fresh each morning. The raking of the coals was a specific and habitual evening task. Using a metal implement called a rake or a poker, the person responsible for the fire would gather the hot coals into a pile in the centre of the hearth and cover them with ash. The ash insulated the coals from the air, slowing their combustion to almost nothing while keeping the heat contained. A well-covered coal pile could remain alive for 8 or 10 hours, a slow ember in the ash, ready to be uncovered and blown back into flame in the morning. The technique of covering coals for the night was universal across many cultures that used open fires, and it was one of those practical skills that was learned early and performed automatically without much thought, the hands moving through the familiar motions of the evening fire covering while the mind was already beginning to let go of the day. In Scotland and Ireland, the banking of the peat fire was often accompanied by a spoken blessing or a prayer, a brief ritual acknowledgement of the fire's importance to the household, and a request for its continuance through the night. The prayers associated with this practice, some of which were collected by folklorists in the 19th century before they were entirely forgotten, are quiet and specific, addressing the fire in familiar terms, asking it to stay alive until morning, connecting the domestic act of banking the fire with the larger rhythms of divine providence. These prayers have a quality of deep familiarity, the familiarity of a thing said every evening for generations, worn smooth by repetition into something that no longer needed to be thought about but was simply said, like the signing of a letter or the closing of a door. The covering of fires at night was also a civic regulation in many medieval and early modern towns, as we touched on in our previous story about medieval laws. The curfew, whose name means cover fire, was the signal at which fires were supposed to be covered or extinguished for the night, and the ringing of the curfew bell was simultaneously a time signal and a fire safety measure. A town full of open fires burning through the night was a town at significant risk of catastrophic fire, and the management of domestic fires at night was therefore not merely a personal and household concern, but a matter of community safety. Chapter 4. Candles and their making. The candle was the most portable and most versatile source of artificial light available to most people for most of the pre-electric period, and the making, managing, and economizing of candles was a significant part of the household economy. A candle seems a simple thing, but in the context of a household that had to make or purchase every candle it burned, and that could not simply switch on a light, the candle took on an importance that is difficult to appreciate from our current position. There were two main types of candle available to most households: tallow candles and beeswax candles. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat, typically beef or mutton tallow, and they were inexpensive enough to be within the reach of most households, though they had significant disadvantages. They burned with a softer, smokier flame than beeswax candles. They smelled when burning, a fatty, somewhat unpleasant smell that became the background smell of any room in which they were regularly used. They needed to be trimmed frequently, because the wick would develop a char that caused the candle to burn unevenly and to produce more smoke, and they softened in warm weather, which made them inconvenient to store in summer. Beeswax candles were better in every practical respect. They burned more cleanly, with less smoke and no unpleasant smell. Their flame was brighter and steadier. They kept better in warm weather, and they lasted longer per unit of weight. But they were significantly more expensive than tallow candles, because beeswax was more costly than tallow, and this meant that beeswax candles were used primarily by wealthier households and by the church, which used large quantities of beeswax candles for liturgical purposes, and considered the purity of beeswax appropriate for sacred light in a way that animal fat was not. The making of candles in the household was a regular autumn task in many households that could not afford to buy ready-made candles in sufficient quantities. Candle making required tallow, which was obtained from the butcher or from the household's own animals at slaughter time, and wicks, which were made from twisted cotton or hemp thread. The tallow was melted in a pot, and the wicks were dipped into it repeatedly, each dip adding a thin layer of tallow that solidified before the next dip. The candle grew with each dipping, layer by layer, until it had reached the desired thickness. The process was slow and repetitive, and a person making candles would stand at the dipping pot for a long time, moving through the same motion over and over, and the candles would gradually become real candles, thick enough to burn for the hours the household needed them to burn. The storage of candles required attention, because tallow candles could be damaged by heat, by cold in the extreme, by mice and rats who found tallow attractive, and by the general humidity and dust of household storage. They were typically stored in a cool, dry place, in boxes or on shelves, away from the kitchen where the warmth would soften them. The household's candle supply was a significant asset, and the managing of it, ensuring that enough candles were in stock for the winter's evenings, without wasting any, was part of the housewife's or housekeeper's regular calculation. The candle holder in common use was a simple metal spike or socket, designed to hold the candle upright at the right height for the light to be useful. Brass and pewter candlesticks were common in houses that could afford them. Simple iron ones served in humbler homes. The rushlight holder, which was designed for the even cheaper rushlight rather than a true candle, was a common implement in poorer households, consisting of a simple clamp that held the rush at an angle as it burned. Chapter 5. Rushlights and the Purest Light. The rushlight was the cheapest form of artificial light available in the pre-electric rural world, and it is worth giving it a chapter of its own because it was so widely used for so long, and because the process of making and using it has a quality of patient, careful economy that is characteristic of the pre-electric household's relationship with light. A rushlight was made from the common rush, a plant that grew in damp places across most of Europe, and the process of making it was simple enough to be done by any household that had access to rushes and a source of grease. The rushes were gathered in summer and stripped of most of their green outer casing, leaving the soft white pith inside supported by a thin strip of the outer casing on one side. This strip of casing gave the pith support so that it could be handled without breaking. The stripped rushes were then dried completely, because a damp rush would not burn properly and would sputter and go out. Once dry, the rushes were soaked in melted fat, which was typically the cheapest available fat, the drippings from cooking, the rendered fat of whatever animals the household kept. The fat soaked into the porous pith of the rush, and when it solidified, provided the fuel for the rushlight's flame. A well-made rushlight soaked in good fat would burn for somewhere between 20 minutes and half an hour, depending on its length, which was a short time, but which was not nothing in a household where light was precious. The rural clergyman Gilbert White, writing in the 18th century in his Natural History of Selborne, described in detail the making and burning of rushlights, and his account is both practically specific and quietly affectionate. the description of a very ordinary thing done with great care. He calculated the cost of a year's worth of rushlights for a modest household, and found it quite small, a fraction of the cost of candles, and noted that the poor people of his parish who could not afford candles used rushlights as their primary artificial light. The rushlight, in White's description, is not a thing of poverty and deprivation, but a thing of practical ingenuity, making good use of materials that were free and available to produce a small but real and useful quantity of light. The light produced by a rushlight was dim by any measure. It was not the kind of light by which you could read comfortably, though people did read by it, bending close to the page. It was not bright enough to illuminate a whole room, only the immediate vicinity of the rush itself. But it was light, real light, enough to see what you were doing in the direct vicinity of the flame, enough to move around the room without stumbling, enough to find the bed and settle the children and complete the last small tasks of the evening before lying down in the dark. The quality of the rushlight's flame was very gentle. It was a small, quiet flame, not the robust flame of a candle, not the substantial heat and light of the fire, but something softer and more tentative, burning its narrow wick of pith down from one end toward the other, with a slow and measured pace that made it a kind of timer as well as a light. A household that had one rushlight left and needed to make it last through the essential final tasks of the evening would work within the soft boundary of that light, doing what needed to be done in its narrow circle and then lying down as it guttered and went out. Chapter 6. The bedroom before electricity. The bedroom of the pre-electric period was a different room from what we understand a bedroom to be, and it is worth thinking about this difference in some detail, because the difference tells us a great deal about how sleep was understood and prepared for in the world before artificial light made the bedroom simply a room with a bed, where you happen to end up at the end of an evening spent in other rooms doing other things. In wealthy households of the medieval and early modern period, the bedroom, or the bedchamber, was not merely a room for sleeping. It was a room for receiving visitors, for conducting private business, for dressing and undressing with the assistance of servants, and for a variety of other activities that required privacy and proximity to a bed, but did not involve sleeping. The great beds of these households, with their curtains and canopies and multiple mattresses, were statements of wealth and status, as well as sleeping places, and the management of these beds was a significant household operation involving specific servants and specific procedures, as we discussed in the earlier story about royal palace servants. In humbler households, which is to say most households, the sleeping arrangements were considerably more straightforward, and the question of where everyone slept was largely determined by the number of rooms available and the number of people who needed to sleep in them. In a one-room cottage, everyone slept in the one room, the fire at one end providing what warmth there was, the family arranged in whatever sleeping positions the available furniture and floor allowed. In houses with more rooms, children and servants might sleep in separate spaces, but sharing a bed with other family members or with other household members was entirely normal, and continued to be normal well into the 19th century in most households. The shared bed was a practical necessity in a world without central heating. Body warmth was a significant source of warmth in a cold bedroom, and the cold bedrooms of the pre-electric world were genuinely cold, sometimes with ice on the inside of the windows in severe winters. The practice of warming the bed with a bed warmer before getting in was widespread among households that could afford the implement, which was a covered metal pan containing hot coals or hot embers on a long handle, pushed between the sheets and moved around to warm the bed before the occupants got in. The warming of the bed was a real and practical preparation for sleep, not a luxury, because getting into a cold bed was an unpleasant experience that delayed sleep, and a pre-warmed bed was a much more welcoming place. The mattress itself, in most households, was a fabric casing filled with some kind of stuffing material. The filling varied by wealth and availability. The finest mattresses were filled with down, the soft underfeathers of geese or ducks, which was warm and soft and expensive. Wool was a more affordable filling, providing reasonable warmth and reasonable softness. Straw was the cheapest option, widely used by poorer households, and a straw mattress that had not been recently restuffed and fluffed could become quite flat and lumpy and uncomfortable. The annual restuffing of mattresses, replacing old straw with fresh, was a household task that was typically done in late summer or autumn, and a freshly stuffed straw mattress had a particular pleasant smell of dry grass and summer that was one of the better smells of the pre-electric household's year. The bed curtains served multiple practical purposes. They kept out drafts, which were a significant problem in buildings that were not well sealed against the weather. They provided darkness, which was helpful in rooms where the household's sleeping and waking hours did not perfectly align, allowing one person to sleep while another worked by candlelight, and they provided privacy in the shared sleeping spaces that were common in large households. The drawing of the bed curtains at night was a deliberate act, a physical closing of the sleeper's space that had a quality of settling and completion that the modern sleeper getting into an open bed in a room that is theirs alone does not have in the same way. Chapter 7. The Nightcap and Nightclothes. The nightcap was a real garment, worn by real people at night, and not merely a figure of speech. It was a soft cap made of wool or linen, tied under the chin to keep it in place, and its purpose was entirely practical. The head loses a significant proportion of the body's heat, and in a cold bedroom without any source of heat beyond the bed curtains and the shared warmth of the occupants, keeping the head covered significantly improved the warmth and comfort of the sleeper. The nightcap was therefore a sensible and widely adopted piece of sleep equipment, worn by men and women and children across most of the pre-electric period and across most of the social spectrum. The nightcap in art and literature is sometimes used as a symbol of domestic comfort and retirement from the world, and there is something in this symbolic use that reflects a real quality of the object. The nightcap was the garment you put on when the day was definitively over, when you had come in from the world and closed the door and settled the fire and were ready to be nowhere but where you were. Putting on the nightcap was one of the physical acts of transition from the active day to the sleeping night, and like all such physical acts it had a psychological dimension that went beyond the purely practical. The rest of the nightclothes, where nightclothes existed, served the same combination of practical and ritual functions. For much of the pre-electric period and across most social classes, sleeping in a dedicated sleeping garment was not universal. Many people, particularly in earlier centuries and in poorer households, slept in whatever underclothes they had worn during the day, or in nothing at all, or in some combination depending on the season and the warmth of the bedroom. The wearing of a dedicated nightgown or nightshirt as a separate garment specifically for sleep was more common among the middle and upper classes and became gradually more widespread as prosperity increased and as the specific garment for sleep became established as a category. The nightgown, where it was worn, was typically a loose, comfortable garment, easier to move in than daytime clothes and designed for the particular requirements of sleep. Warm enough to provide comfort but not so constricting as to interfere with movement in the night. Linen was a common material, valued both for its comfort and for its washability, because the washing of bed linens and night clothes was a regular and important household task in the pre-electric world. Flannel was used in colder climates and seasons, providing additional warmth without too much weight. The routine of changing into night clothes was itself part of the transition from day to night, a physical marker of the boundary between the two, the removal of the day's clothes, the putting on of the night's clothes, the final washing of the face and hands if water was available and warm enough to make this practical, the brushing of the hair, the removal of the pins that had held it in place through the day. All of these small acts accumulated into a ritual of transition that prepared the body and the mind for sleep in a way that was both practical and psychological. The body, having been through these motions, knew what came next. Chapter 8: The Evening Meal and the Wind Down. In the pre-electric household, the evening meal was typically the last significant event before the household settled for the night, and its timing was shaped by the available light and by the practical requirements of fire management. In many historical households, the main meal of the day was eaten in the early afternoon, when daylight was plentiful, and the fire was already well established for cooking. The evening meal, sometimes called supper, was a lighter affair, eaten by the remaining light of late afternoon, or by candlelight or firelight, and it marked the beginning of the wind down towards sleep. The food at supper was typically simpler than the midday meal, requiring less preparation and less cooking. Bread and cheese were the foundation of many historical suppers, available without cooking and satisfying without heaviness. Cold meat left from the midday meal if there was any. Porridge or gruel made quickly over the evening fire. Soup kept warm from the day's cooking. Whatever fruit or vegetables were in season and could be eaten raw or with minimal preparation. The supper was not the occasion for elaboration, but for settling, for the quiet consumption of food that would sustain the sleeper through the night without loading the stomach so heavily that sleep was difficult. The drink at supper was typically small ale or weak beer in most of Northern Europe, because water from wells and streams was not reliably safe to drink, and fermented drinks, even low-alcohol ones, were safer. A cup of small ale with supper, and perhaps another later in the evening, was the normal evening drink for most people in most of the pre-electric period. Wine was available to those who could afford it. Hot drinks came later in the period. tea and coffee becoming widespread in England and Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the evening cup of tea or tisane gradually replaced small ale as the standard evening drink for many households, bringing with it a new small ritual of heating water and steeping herbs or leaves that added another gentle procedure to the evening sequence. After supper, the household wound down. In the earlier part of the pre-electric period, in many peasant households, this winding down was rapid, because there was genuinely nothing to do in the dark, and the body, tired from a long day of physical work, was ready for sleep. In later periods and in wealthier households, the evening might include reading or conversation or needlework or music or cards or other activities that could be done by candlelight, and the household might sit together by the fire for an hour or more before the candles were extinguished and the beds were taken to. The reading of the Bible or other religious texts was a common evening activity in Protestant households across Northern Europe and in the American colonies, and the family Bible reading before bed had a quality of both intellectual engagement and settling that was appropriate to the transition towards sleep. The familiar texts, read in a familiar voice, in a familiar room by a familiar light, had a quality of repetition and regularity that was itself calming, the words known well enough that they did not demand alert attention, but could be received in the partially relaxed state of someone whose day was ending. Chapter 9. Children and Bedtime. Children in the pre-electric world were put to bed earlier than adults, for the same practical reasons that children are put to bed earlier now, because children need more sleep, and because they are less able than adults to manage the difficult balance between being tired enough to sleep and being so tired that they become fractious and resistant. But the management of children's bedtime in the pre-electric world had its own specific character, shaped by the available light and warmth, and by the particular domestic arrangements of the period. In many historical households, children shared beds with other children and sometimes with adults, partly for warmth and partly because the number of beds was limited. The sharing of a bed required negotiation about sleeping positions and about the covering of the bed, and children who shared beds developed the particular skills of shared sleeping, the ability to get in and settle without disturbing the others, to find and maintain a sleeping position within the shared space, and to tolerate the various sounds and movements of other bodies without being woken by them. The bedtime story or the bedtime prayer was a feature of children's bedtimes in many historical periods, and it served the same psychological functions that it serves now, providing a transition between the activity of the day and the stillness of sleep, giving the child something to attend to that was not urgent and not demanding, but that engaged the mind just enough to crowd out the anxieties and excitements of the day. The biblical psalms and prayers that formed the content of many historical children's bedtimes were familiar texts, heard many times before, whose content was largely known, and whose primary function at bedtime was therefore more rhythmic than informational, the regular cadences of familiar word providing the same kind of settling that a familiar piece of music provides. The fear of the dark was a real concern for children in the pre-electric world, and it was managed in various ways. A nightlight, a small candle or rushlight left burning in the child's room or in the corridor outside, was used in households that could afford it. prayers that specifically addressed the night and its dangers, asking for divine protection through the hours of darkness, were standard in many religious traditions and were said with children at bedtime as a matter of course. And the presence of other people in the same room or the same bed was itself a protection against the particular quality of a child's fear of the dark, which is largely a fear of being alone in the dark rather than a fear of the dark itself. The waking of children in the night for any reason was managed without the ease that modern households have, because there was no light to turn on, and the care of a waking child in the dark required either relighting the candle, which was an effort, or managing in the dark, which was difficult. The practical management of this situation was part of what parents in the pre-electric world became expert at in a way that modern parents, with the ease of an electric light switch, do not need to be. Chapter 10. The servants and the last tasks of the evening. In households wealthy enough to have servants, the last tasks of the evening fell to those servants who were designated for the closing up of the house, and these tasks constituted a specific and important part of the servant's role that has its own interest when examined carefully. The last tasks of the evening were the tasks that made the house safe and settled for the night, and they needed to be done properly every evening without exception, because the consequences of doing them improperly could be serious. The most important of the evening tasks was the securing of the fires. Every fire in the house, of which there might be several in a larger establishment, needed to be checked and either banked down safely or extinguished, depending on whether it was to be kept alive for the morning. The checking of the fires was done systematically, moving from room to room, inspecting each hearth, raking down the coals or covering them as appropriate, removing any pieces of wood or paper that might catch and burn independently, making sure that the hearth was clean around the fire and that there was no risk of a coal rolling out onto the floor. Fire was the most serious risk facing the pre-electric household, and the evening fire check was taken seriously as a result. The securing of the house was the next task. The doors needed to be bolted and locked, and the shutters on the windows that had shutters needed to be closed. In many historical households, the closing of the shutters and the bolting of the doors was a specific evening ritual, performed in a specific order, and the servant who did it would have known exactly the sequence from long practice, moving through the house room by room, closing and securing as they went, the house contracting inward as each exterior opening was secured, becoming more itself, more separate from the dark outside. The extinguishing of the candles that had been lit during the evening was done as the servant moved through the house, leaving a trail of darkness behind them, moving from room to room with the last remaining candle until all the others had been put out, and only the one they carried was still burning. This single candle moving through the darkening house toward the servants' quarters was a nightly event, a slow diminishment of light from many candles to one, from a lit and active household to a dark and resting one. The servant who did this last round was performing the same action, in its essentials, that someone in the household had performed every evening for as long as the household had existed. The final candle was extinguished when the servant reached their own sleeping place, and then the house was dark. Chapter 11. what the darkness sounded like. With the light out, the sound of the pre-electric household at night comes into focus in a way that is worth considering, because the pre-electric night had a soundscape that was quite different from the soundscape of a modern night, and thinking about it carefully is a useful and calming occupation. The pre-electric household at night was not silent. The fire, if it was still alive, made small sounds. The settling of coals, the occasional small pop of a piece of wood still drying in the heat, the faint hiss of gases escaping from the embers. The building itself made sounds, the timber and stone of the structure contracting in the cooling temperature of the night, small ticks and creaks that were the sounds of the building's material doing what it did as the temperature dropped, sounds that the inhabitants had heard every night for as long as they had lived there, and that had long since become part of the background of sleep rather than a disturbance to it. The animals in the household made sounds. In many pre-electric households, domestic animals were kept close to the human sleeping spaces, or even within them, both for warmth and for security. And the sounds of these animals, a dog settling on the floor, a cat moving in the dark, the occasional sound from the stable or the barn adjacent to the house, were part of the normal soundscape of the night. These animal sounds were familiar and therefore reassuring rather than alarming. The sounds of the household's non-human members going about their own version of the night's activities. The sounds from outside varied with the season and the location. In the countryside, the night sounds of the natural world were present and continuous. The calls of owls, the sound of wind in trees, the sound of rain when it rained, the sound of frost settling in the coldest nights, a sound that is almost but not quite silence. In towns, the sounds of other households carried through the walls and the streets, the occasional sound of footsteps on cobblestones, the sound of the night watch if there was one, the bells of the church or the town clock marking the hours in the dark. The church bell marking the hours through the night was a familiar and important presence in the soundscape of the pre-electric night. The bell that rang for the hours divided the night into measured sections and provided a kind of company, a reminder that the world was still organized and that time was still passing in its orderly way, even in the complete darkness of the hours between sunset and sunrise. Hearing the bell ring for midnight, or for 2 a.m, from your bed, without getting up or doing anything, simply noting the passage of time, was a specific experience of the pre-electric night that was entirely ordinary and is now almost entirely gone. The bells also rang for the church offices. Matins, which was the night office in the monastic tradition, was sung in the small hours of the morning, and the bell that called the monks to matins was heard by everyone within earshot. A bell in the deep dark that was not an emergency, but a summons to a specific kind of activity, the singing of the night prayers for the monks in the monastery. This bell required getting up from warm beds and moving in the cold dark to the chapel. For the inhabitants of the village near the monastery, it was simply a sound in the night, the familiar deep tone of the bell moving through the dark, meaning what it had always meant, that the monastery was there and its life was continuing. Chapter 12. Sleep itself in the pre-electric world. The sleep that came after all of this preparation, in the genuine darkness and the relatively quiet of the pre-electric night, had characteristics that are worth thinking about in some detail, partly because those characteristics are interesting in themselves, and partly because thinking about them carefully in the way of this story is exactly the kind of steady and unhurried mental activity that the present moment calls for. The darkness of the pre-electric night was, as we have established, more complete than the darkness most modern sleepers experience. This completeness had effects on the quality of sleep. The human sleep cycle is significantly regulated by light through the action of melatonin, which is a hormone whose production is suppressed by light and stimulated by darkness. In the complete darkness of the pre-electric bedroom, melatonin production was not interrupted by the small lights that are present in most modern bedrooms, and the depth and quality of the sleep that resulted was, by some measures, different from the sleep that modern people get. The temperature of the pre-electric bedroom also affected sleep in ways that are worth noting. Cold bedrooms, which were the norm for most people for most of the pre-electric period, have effects on sleep that modern research has begun to document. The body's core temperature drops during sleep, and sleeping in a cool environment facilitates this drop and is associated with deeper and more restorative sleep. The very cold bedrooms of the pre-electric world may therefore have contributed to a quality of sleep that was in some respects more complete than the sleep achieved in the warm, evenly heated bedrooms that central heating makes possible. The two-phase sleep pattern that we discussed earlier, with first sleep and second sleep separated by a period of quiet wakefulness, was a feature of the pre-electric night that was simply accepted as the normal pattern of sleep rather than experienced as a problem. The period between first and second sleep was used, as we noted, for various quiet activities, and the resumption of second sleep after this period was typically easy and natural, the body having rested sufficiently in the first sleep to be no longer urgently in need of rest, but still willing to sleep further when it lay down again. The quality of the sleep itself was also shaped by the physical exhaustion that was a feature of daily life for most pre-electric people. Most people before electricity did physical work that used the body continuously through the day, and the tiredness that this work produced was the particular tiredness of physical effort that translates most directly and most willingly into sleep. The person who has spent the day in physical labour comes to bed with a tiredness in the muscles and the joints that makes the bed feel like the right place to be, and the sleep that follows comes without the effort that it sometimes takes for a person who has spent the day sitting and thinking and managing screens and abstract problems. Chapter 13. Seasonal differences in pre-electric bedtime. The relationship between bedtime and the seasons was much more direct in the pre-electric world than it tends to be now, and the experience of winter evenings and summer evenings was strikingly different from each other in ways that shaped not just the timing of sleep, but its texture and quality. In winter, the short days meant that darkness fell early, sometimes as early as 4 in the afternoon in the northernmost parts of Europe, and the long hours of winter darkness had to be managed somehow. The evening hours from dark until sleep were long, and the activities that could be done by firelight and candlelight in those hours were limited. Spinning and weaving could be done by firelight, and historically were. The long winter evenings were a significant part of the spinning economy, and the spindle and the distaff were the constant companions of women's winter evenings across much of the pre-electric world. Mending and other sewing could be done carefully by a good candle. Reading could be done, though the cost of the candle had to be weighed against the value of the reading. In the coldest months of winter, the household might go to bed earlier simply because the bed was the warmest available place. Getting into a warmed bed, drawing the curtains and lying still under the covers was warmer than sitting by a fire that needed constant feeding, and that produced warmth only in its immediate vicinity. The bed, well furnished with mattress and coverlets, and the warmth of the occupants, maintained its warmth through the night in a way that the room around it did not, and the transition from the cooling room to the warm bed was one of the genuine pleasures of the winter evening that the pre-electric person experienced regularly. Summer was different in almost every respect. The long days of summer meant that darkness came late, and the pressure to be in bed before dark was absent. The warmth of summer meant that the fire was not needed for warmth, only for cooking, and the cooking fire that had heated the house through the winter became an inconvenience in summer, the kitchen hot and the smell of the fire unwelcome on warm evenings. The lighter summer nights, with the sky not fully dark until 10 or later in northern latitudes, made it possible to be active outdoors until late without any artificial light, and the summer evening was correspondingly more expansive and less governed by the management of light sources than the winter evening. In agricultural communities, the summer was also the time of the most demanding work. The haymaking and the grain harvest, and the various other activities that needed to be done in the long summer days, and the exhaustion of the body after a full summer day of harvest work was such that sleep came readily and early, despite the length of the light. The harvest workers who had been in the field since dawn, and who had worked through the long summer day, came to their beds in the evening not troubled by the lingering light, but simply too tired to be troubled by anything, and the short summer night was sufficient for the sleep they needed, because the sleep was the deep sleep of genuine physical exhaustion. Chapter 14. Pre-electric bedtime across different cultures. The experience of bedtime before electricity was not uniform across the world, and a brief survey of how different cultures managed the end of the day and the beginning of sleep adds a useful variety to the picture we have been building. In ancient Rome, the management of light and the end of the day followed patterns that are in some respects familiar from what we have already discussed, and in others quite different. The Romans used oil lamps rather than candles as their primary source of artificial light, and the Roman oil lamp, a small ceramic or metal vessel with a wick floating in olive oil, was a technology that was efficient and widespread across the Mediterranean world. The olive oil lamp produced a steadier and somewhat cleaner light than a tallow candle, though it still produced smoke and required regular attention to keep the wick at the right length and the oil at the right level. Wealthy Romans had multiple oil lamps in use simultaneously in their larger rooms, and the management of these lamps, the trimming of wicks and the refilling of oil, was a servant's task. The Romans also had a version of the candle made from tallow or beeswax, used in situations where the portability of a candle was more convenient than the lamp. The night management of fires in Roman households was similar in its essentials to what we have already described: the covering and banking of coals for the night, the securing of the building, the extinguishing of the lamps and candles as sleep approached. In Japan, before the adoption of Western practices, the evening routines of the household followed their own specific form. The charcoal brazier, the hibachi or the irori, the sunken floor hearth, provided warmth in the winter months, and the management of the charcoal fire at the end of the evening was part of the household's closing routine. The paper screens and sliding doors of traditional Japanese architecture meant that the house could be reconfigured quite easily, and the closing of the house for the night involved arranging the screens and doors in the appropriate sleeping configuration, a set of actions that transformed the space of the house from its daytime arrangement to its nighttime one. The sleeping arrangements in traditional Japanese households included the futon, the padded mat that was laid out for sleeping and folded away during the day, which meant that the act of preparing for sleep involved the physical act of laying out the bedding, a deliberate preparation of the sleeping space that took a few minutes and that had its own quality of transition. The putting down of the futon, the arranging of the pillow, the covering of the blankets in the correct order, was a small ritual of preparation that created a sleeping space out of what had been during the day a living space, and this transformation was itself part of the transition towards sleep. In the traditions of many indigenous cultures around the world, the transition between waking and sleeping was managed through specific rituals that connected the individual household's ending of the day with broader cultural and spiritual frameworks. The telling of stories in the evening, which was a feature of many pre-literate cultures, served the function of transmitting cultural knowledge, but also functioned as a wind-down activity. The familiar narratives heard many times before providing a transition from the day's activity to the night's rest. The gradual reduction in the pace and the energy of the storytelling as the evening advanced, the voices becoming quieter, the stories becoming shorter and less eventful, was a natural preparation for the silence that sleep required. Chapter 15. The Bed Warmer and Other Pre-Electric Comforts. The practical comforts of the pre-electric bed were not merely the warmth and softness of the bed itself, but a set of auxiliary items and practices that made the experience of going to bed in an unheated bedroom less harsh. The bed warmer, which we mentioned briefly in an earlier chapter, deserves a fuller description here because it is a particularly good example of the pre-electric household's practical ingenuity in managing the challenges of its situation. The bed warmer was a metal pan, typically of brass or copper, with a hinged lid with holes in it, attached to a long wooden handle. The pan was filled with hot coals from the fire or with hot embers, and the lid was closed to prevent the coals from falling out. The warmer was then pushed between the sheets of the bed and moved around carefully, warming the cold linen without burning it. The long handle was necessary because the pan needed to be moved around the whole area of the bed to warm it evenly, and the holes in the lid allowed enough heat to escape to do the warming, while the solid lid prevented direct contact between the coals and the fabric. The bed warmer was a significant household implement in cold climates, and it was used across a wide range of the social spectrum, from modest households to great ones. The version used in wealthy households might be of polished brass, carefully maintained and kept as a presentable object. The version used in a more modest household might be of plain iron, serviceable but not ornamental. The function was the same, the transformation of a cold and unwelcoming bed into a warm and welcoming one, achieved through the simple application of hot coals and careful handling. The warming pan, as it was also called, was not the only method for warming a bed. A hot water bottle filled with hot water from the fire and wrapped in cloth was used where it was available. Heated bricks wrapped in flannel were placed at the foot of the bed to keep the feet warm through the night. In some traditions, the heating of a flat stone in the fire and its careful wrapping and placement in the bed served the same function at no cost beyond the fuel to heat the stone. The principle in all cases was the same, the storage of heat from the fire in a form that could be transferred to the bed, making the bed warm enough to enter without the shock of cold that made getting into an unheated bed an unpleasant experience. The nightcap, which we discussed in an earlier chapter, was also a practical comfort of the pre-electric bed, and so were the bed curtains, and so was the habit of having a pre-warmed brick or stone at the feet. These various comforts taken together made the pre-electric bed, at its best, genuinely comfortable and welcoming, the warmth contained within the curtains and the covers providing a microclimate of comfort within the cold of the bedroom, a small warm world within the larger cold world, the sleeper at its centre. Chapter 16. What happened in the night. Between the putting out of the last light and the return of morning, a number of things happened in the pre-electric household that are worth knowing about, because they were a part of the texture of the pre-electric night in ways that we have largely lost. The baby that needed feeding in the night was managed in the dark or by the light of whatever small candle could be quickly lit, and the mother who had done this many times moved through the familiar motions of the night, feeding with the particular efficiency of someone performing a well-practiced task in imperfect conditions. The feeding and settling of the baby in the night was a regular interruption to the pre-electric parent's sleep that required getting out of the warm bed and into the cold room and doing what needed to be done and getting back in, and the skill with which this was managed with minimum disturbance to the rest of the household was a practical skill developed through experience. The ill person in the household was attended in the night if attending was needed. The person designated as the night nurse, whether a family member or a hired nurse, sat by the bed through the long dark hours, maintaining the fire if the patient needed warmth, administering whatever remedies had been prescribed at whatever intervals were required, and monitoring the patient's condition with whatever knowledge they had. Night nursing in the pre-electric world was a demanding and often lonely occupation. Hours of quiet attention in a dim room, watching a person sleep or struggle with illness, with nothing to do but watch and wait and be there. The animals that shared the building needed attention through the night if they were sick or if they were close to delivering young. The farmer who slept lightly and who woke instinctively to check the animals in the small hours was performing a kind of night watch over the household's most valuable assets, the animals on whose health the household's prosperity depended. A cow about to deliver a calf needed assistance. and the farm family that produced that assistance in the small hours of a winter night, in the cold and the dark of the barn, was performing an act of practical care that was entirely ordinary in its context and entirely representative of the pre-electric household's relationship with the cycle of life and the demands it made at all hours. The simple turning in one's sleep, the adjusting of the position, the brief partial waking that happens naturally several times in the night, these two were part of the pre-electric night in the same way they are part of the modern night, because they are features of human sleep, rather than features of any particular technological era. The pre-electric sleeper who woke briefly in the deep of the first sleep and turned and pulled the covers and settled again, perhaps hearing the fire settle or the wind outside and noting these things without quite waking fully, was having the same experience in its physical and neurological essentials that any sleeper in any period has several times in every night. Chapter 17, The Return of Morning. After all of this, after the banking of the fire and the putting out of the candles and the warming of the bed and the settling of the children and the first sleep and the waking between and the second sleep, morning came. Morning in the pre-electric world was a different kind of event from morning now, because it was the return of light to a world that had been genuinely dark, and this return had a quality of renewal that the gradual brightening of a modern morning from one level of artificial and natural light to another does not quite replicate. The first light of dawn was visible first in the sky above the eastern horizon, a slow brightening of the dark that was perceptible perhaps an hour before the sun itself appeared. This early light was sufficient on a clear day to allow movement around the house without a candle, and the person who rose early to attend to the fire and the animals and the beginning of the day's work used this light to manage by without the trouble of relighting anything. The light returned, reliable as it had always been, and the house that had been dark and contracted in upon itself opened again, the shutters being unlatched and pushed open, the air coming in, the sounds of the waking world entering with the light. The arrival of the fire was the first task of the morning for the person who had the responsibility of it, which in most households was the person who rose first, which in most households was the housewife or the most senior female servant. The covered coals from the night before, if they had stayed alive, needed only to be uncovered and blown on, gently and steadily, the breath directed at the base of the coals where the glow was brightest, until the coals took up again and the fire was re-established. If the coals had gone out entirely, the fire needed to be relit from scratch, which required tinder and a flint or a fire steel, the striking of sparks onto the tinder, the careful blowing of the caught spark in the tinder into a flame, the transferring of this small flame to the kindling laid on the hearth, the feeding of the kindling until the fire was established, enough to take larger fuel. The relighting of the fire was a more involved process than the mere revival of covered coals, and the experienced firelighter moved through it with practiced efficiency, the hands knowing what to do without requiring much direction from the mind. The relit fire changed the room. The warmth began to spread from the hearth. The light of the fire added to the growing light from the windows. The smell of the smoke and the smell of the wood or the peat or the coal, depending on what was used, mixed with the morning air coming in through the opened windows. the house was awake. Chapter 18. The Tallow Candle as Timekeeper. There's one last thing about the pre-electric experience of night and bedtime that is worth dwelling on, because it is particularly specific and particularly evocative, and that is the role of the candle as a timekeeper. In the absence of mechanical clocks, which were expensive and not available in most households for most of the pre-electric period, the burning candle was one of the available methods of marking the passage of time at night. A candle of known size, burning at a known rate, was a clock of sorts, and the candle clock was used in various forms from antiquity onward. King Alfred the Great of England in the 9th century is said to have used graduated candles marked with rings to measure the hours of his day and to ensure that he spent equal amounts of time on prayer, governance, and rest, though historians treat this story with some caution. The more practical version of the candle clock was simply the knowledge of how long a given size and type of candle would burn, which any household that regularly used candles would develop through experience. A household candle that was expected to last the evening was chosen on the basis of this knowledge, and the burning down of the candle provided a rough indication of the passage of time, and when the candle was visibly low, an indication that it was time to think about sleep or about lighting the next candle. The watching of a candle burn down is in itself a meditative activity. The flame is constant in its essential character but variable in its details, moving slightly in any current of air, the wax around the wick forming and reforming into the characteristic pool of melted wax, the wick gradually shortening as it burns, the candle becoming gradually and steadily smaller. There is something in the watching of a candle that encourages a kind of quiet attention, an attention that is present but not demanding, that observes without analysing, that lets time pass without particularly noting it. The people of the pre-electric world who sat by their candles in the evening were not watching them consciously as clocks, but were living in the light they provided, and the gradual diminishment of that light was part of the texture of the evening, in the same way that the gradual cooling of the fire was part of it. Both the fire and the candle were tending toward darkness all evening. The management of the evening was in part the management of this tendency, feeding the fire and lighting new candles to maintain the light that the evening required, and then, when the time was right, allowing the tendency to complete itself, letting the fire go low and the candle go out and the darkness come. The darkness that came when the last candle was extinguished was not the abrupt and total darkness that the act of switching off an electric light produces, but the darkness that remained after something had gradually ceased, a darkness that was already present around the small circle of the candle's light, and that simply expanded to fill the room when the candle no longer held it back. That is the darkness we're in now, or the equivalent of it. The candle has gone out, the fire is low, the room is as it is meant to be at this hour. Chapter 19. The Long Continuity of Night. We have spent a long evening together considering the pre-electric bedtime, the fire management and the candle making and the nightcaps and the bed warmers and the two-phase sleep and the first light of morning, and all the specific and ordinary details of how people in the centuries before electricity ended their days and began their nights. And what this long consideration shows if you have been following it with the quiet attention it deserves, is that the essential experience of bedtime has not changed very much beneath all the technological differences. The fire and the candle and the tallow lamp are different from the electric light, but the person going to bed at the end of the day, making the final preparations, settling the body into the position that feels right and pulling the covers up and letting the mind slow down, is not so different from you right now. The nightcap is gone, the rush light is gone, the bed warmer is mostly gone, or has been replaced by an electric blanket. The first sleep and the second sleep have mostly merged into one. The curfew bell no longer rings. The church bell that marked the midnight hours has been replaced by the silence of a world in which night is no longer a distinct and separate territory, but merely a reduced version of the day, still lit and still connected by screens and by the steady ambient light of the modern world. But the sleep that comes at the end of it all is the same sleep. The body's need for rest is unchanged. The slow drift from wakefulness into sleep, the loosening of the grip on the day's concerns, the settling of the breath into the longer, slower rhythm of sleep, the gradual withdrawal of attention from the world outside the body, all of this proceeds in exactly the same way it has always proceeded, in the bed of the pre-electric cottager and in the great curtained bed of the palace chamber, and in the straw pallet of the medieval servant, and in the sleeping roll of the ancient traveller, and in your bed right now. The dark is here. The day is over. The fire is low, in whatever form the fire takes in your life, the accumulated warmth and light of the day burning down to its embers, the room settling around you, the sounds of the night establishing themselves in the quiet that the day's activity has left behind. You do not need to do anything. You only need to do what human beings have done at the end of every day since there have been days to end and human beings to end them. Let go of the day. Let the dark have it. Let the warmth of the bed settle around you. Let the breath slow. Let the mind do what the mind does when nothing is required of it, which is nothing, which is the thing that looks like sleep from the outside and feels like nothing at all from the inside. The candle is out, the fire is banked, the house is secure, the night is here. Sleep well. A closing note on the darkness. There is one final thought for those who are still with us at this very late point in the evening, which is this. The darkness that the pre-electric world knew at night, the complete and uncompromised darkness that came when the last fire was banked and the last candle was out, was not experienced as a problem or as a deficiency by the people who lived in it. It was simply the night. It was the other half of the day, the half that the body needed for rest, the half that was as natural and as regular as the light half, arriving every evening and departing every morning with a reliability that was itself a form of comfort. We live in a world that has largely abolished that darkness, that has filled the night with the residual glow of human activity, so that the complete dark is available only in remote places, and only to those who seek it out. Whether this is a loss, and whether there is something in the completeness of pre-electric darkness that sleep required, and that we have inadvertently diminished, is a question that historians of sleep and researchers of human circadian rhythms have begun to take seriously. But that is a question for another time. Tonight, here, The darkness that you have is the darkness that you have, and it is enough. The body knows how to sleep in it. The body has been sleeping in one kind of darkness or another for as long as there have been bodies, and it has not forgotten how. The darkness is here. The quiet is here. The warmth of the bed is here. The long day is behind you, and the morning is ahead, and between them is the night, old and patient and entirely on your side. Let it do what it does. Close your eyes. The nightcap is on. The fire is banked. The candle is out. The bed is warm. The curtains are drawn. The house is quiet. The night watch has passed. The church bell has just rung, a deep and steady tone moving through the dark, meaning nothing urgent, only that the hours are passing as they have always passed. Sleep now, sleep well. Good night. Chapter 20. The Bedtime of the Medieval Peasant. We have spoken in general terms about the pre-electric bedtime, but it is worth spending some time with specific people in specific situations, because the generalities are easier to understand when they are grounded in particular cases. Let us begin with the medieval peasant, who is perhaps the most representative figure of the pre-electric world in terms of the simplicity and the directness of the relationship between their daily life and the rhythms of light and dark. The medieval peasant's house was small and simple. In much of medieval England and northern Europe, the standard house of a peasant family was a longhouse, or a crook house, a single large room, or a small number of rooms, with walls of timber and plaster or of stone, and a roof of thatch. The floor was earth, sometimes packed hard and sometimes scattered with rushes or straw. There was a hearth in the centre or against one wall, open to the room without a chimney in the earliest periods, with a hole in the roof above it to let out the smoke. The smoke that filled the upper part of the room as it made its way out through the roof hole was an accepted feature of medieval domestic life, and the furniture and the inhabitants both bore its evidence. In this room, the family of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people lived all the activities of their domestic life. They cooked at the hearth. They ate at a table or on boards laid across trestles. They worked by the fire in the evenings, mending and spinning and doing whatever small tasks the season required. And they slept in the same room, in beds set against the walls, or in a loft above the main space if the house had a loft, or simply on the floor near the fire. The bedtime routine of the medieval peasant family was determined by the available light, and by the requirements of the following day. In the depths of winter, when it was dark by 4 in the afternoon, and the family had been at work since before light, the evening might be short. The fire would be tended, the simple supper eaten, the animals attended to if they were housed nearby, and by 7 or 8 the household might be in bed, the fire banked, the single space of the house dark and quiet, except for the breathing of the sleepers and the small sounds of the cooling fire. The medieval peasant who lay in their bed in the dark of the winter night, with the smell of the smoke and the animals and the close warmth of the family around them, was not experiencing deprivation in the way that the modern person would if placed in those circumstances. They were experiencing their normal life. The close quarters and the darkness and the smells were simply the texture of existence. No more remarkable to them than the texture of a modern bedroom is to its occupant. The bed was warm. The day's work was done. Sleep came. Chapter 21. The Bedtime of the Georgian Gentleman. Moving forward in time and upward in social position, let us consider the bedtime routine of a prosperous Georgian gentleman in the 18th century, a figure who had access to considerably more technology and considerably more comfort than the medieval peasant, but who still lived in a world without electric light and managed the end of the day with the accumulated resources of the pre-electric household. The Georgian gentleman's house was a well-furnished place, with several rooms on each floor, fireplaces in all the principal rooms, and a household of servants to manage the daily requirements of domestic life. The evening routine of such a household would begin with supper, eaten at a reasonable hour, followed by a period of social activity. Cards might be played, music might be performed, the pianoforte or the harpsichord providing the most common form of domestic music in this period. Conversation, which in the Georgian period was considered a serious art, would be the primary occupation of the evening among cultivated people. Candles provided the light for all of this. The Georgian house at a formal evening gathering would be lit by many candles in holders and in chandeliers, and the management of this light required a consistent supply of candles and someone to attend to them. The candle snuffer, a small scissor-like implement for trimming the burnt end of the wick without putting the candle out, was a necessary tool in any well-managed Georgian household, and the servant who attended to the candles was performing a continuous small service throughout the evening, moving through the room periodically to trim the wicks and ensure that the candles were burning at their best. When the evening's entertainment was over and the household was moving toward bed, the candles were extinguished one by one as they were no longer needed, the rooms going dark behind the retiring household. The master of the house might retire with a reading candle, a candlestick with a shade or reflector designed to direct the light toward a book, and read for a while in bed before extinguishing the last candle. The warming pan would have been used to warm the bed against his arrival. The nightcap and nightshirt would be laid out by the valet. The whole apparatus of the Georgian bedtime, more elaborate than the medieval peasants', and significantly less elaborate than the royal palace servants' management of the monarch's bedtime, moved toward its conclusion with a predictable and comfortable orderliness. The Georgian gentleman sleeping in his curtained bed, in a bedroom kept at whatever temperature the fire in the bedroom grate maintained, with the darkness complete beyond the bed curtains, was in a situation that was physically quite different from the modern sleeper, and that was, in certain respects, more favourable to deep and restorative sleep. The absence of artificial light meant that the night was genuinely dark. The relative silence of the Georgian street, at least in a residential neighbourhood and after the evening's activity had died down, meant that the night was quieter than the modern night. The physical tiredness of a day that included walking and physical activity of various kinds meant that the body was genuinely ready for sleep in a way that the modern sedentary life does not always produce. Chapter 22. Colonial American Bedtime. In the American colonies, and in the early years of the American Republic, the bedtime routines of households varied with their prosperity and location, but shared the fundamental characteristics of the pre-electric world that we have been describing. The wilderness of the New World added dimensions to the nighttime experience that were not present in the settled landscapes of England and Europe, and the colonial and early American experience of night and bedtime has its own particular quality that is worth examining. The colonial farmhouse in New England was a substantial timber structure, well built against the severe winters of the region, with multiple fireplaces to heat the various rooms. The central chimney, which heated the kitchen on the ground floor and the bedrooms above through the chimneys that passed through the interior of the house, was a feature of many New England colonial houses, and the warmth of the chimney mass through the night kept the rooms adjacent to it warmer than the rooms further away. The bedroom nearest the chimney was correspondingly the most sought-after sleeping location in cold weather. The evening routines of colonial households were shaped by the rhythms of agricultural life in the particular season, and by the religious observances that were central to many colonial communities. Bible reading and family prayer in the evening were standard features of Puritan and other Protestant colonial households, and the evening prayers that closed the day before sleep were specific and deliberate, not merely a form of habit, but an expression of a theological understanding of sleep as a kind of daily death and waking as a kind of daily resurrection, each night a rehearsal for the final sleep and each morning a type of the resurrection that believers anticipated. The darkness of the colonial American night was the darkness not just of a house without electric light, but of a landscape that was very sparsely inhabited, with great distances of forest or farmland between one settlement and the next, and with the particular quality of darkness that very large areas of natural landscape produce. The sounds of the colonial night included the sounds of the American forest, the calls of night birds and animals that were not familiar to settlers who had come from Europe, sounds that could be alarming to the newly arrived and that became, after some time of familiarity, simply part of the texture of the night. The management of fire in the colonial household was as important as in any pre-electric household, and the responsible management of fire was one of the skills that settlers needed to develop quickly upon arrival. The abundant wood of the American forests made fuel less of a concern than in many parts of Europe, where wood was scarcer and more carefully managed. But the abundance of fuel did not reduce the need for careful fire management, because the risks of fire spreading from hearth to timber house were the same regardless of how much wood was in the wood pile. Chapter 23. The Hermit's Night and Solitary Sleep. Not all pre-electric bedtimes were experienced within a household. The hermit, the solitary monk, the traveller sleeping alone in the open, the shepherd in the upland pasture during the summer grazing season, all experienced the pre-electric night, without the company and the shared warmth of a household, and their experience of bedtime and sleep had its own specific quality. The hermit's cell or the monk's simple room was typically a spare and unornamented space, with a bed or a sleeping bench and a small table and perhaps a stool and whatever small fire the tradition of the hermit's life permitted. The Benedictine monk slept in a dormitory with other monks, waking at prescribed hours for the night offices, the pattern of sleep interrupted by prayer in a way that was the religious life's version of the two-phase sleep that secular people experience from simple natural rhythms. The hermit or the anchorite who lived alone slept in genuine solitude. the night uninterrupted by any human company. The night prayer of the monastic tradition, the office of Compline that was sung at the end of the day before the monks retired, was a formal close of the day that had a quality of finality and release. The words of Compline, which ask for protection through the hours of darkness, acknowledged the vulnerability of the sleeping person and commended that person to divine care, releasing the waking mind from its responsibilities until morning. The singing of Compline in the candle-lit choir of a medieval monastery, the voices rising and falling in the established patterns of the chant, the candles burning in their holders, the stone walls absorbing the sound, was one of the characteristic sounds of the pre-electric night in the regions where monasteries were present, and the end of Compline was the signal for silence, the great silence that covered the monastery until the morning. The shepherd sleeping in the upland pasture in summer managed without a fire in warm weather, and the summer night was managed with only the cloak and the stars and the sounds of the flock and the landscape. The shepherd who knew the pasture and the sounds of the flock could sleep lightly and wake at any unusual sound, distinguishing by ear and by instinct the normal movements of the sheep from the sounds that indicated a predator or a straying animal. This light, attuned sleep was specific to the requirements of the shepherd's work and was different from the deep sleep of the farmhand at home in bed, a different relationship with the night that the particular demands of the work had produced. Chapter 24, Bedtime Prayer and the Sacred Dimension of Sleep. The religious understanding of sleep in the pre-electric world gave bedtime a dimension that it does not necessarily have for most modern people, and this dimension is worth exploring because it shaped the specific practices and words associated with the transition from waking to sleeping in significant ways across many different traditions. In the Christian tradition, sleep was understood through a set of images and associations that connected it with death, with trust in God, and with the vulnerability of the human being before the larger powers of the universe. The psalms that were most associated with evening and sleep, particularly Psalm 4 and Psalm 91, expressed this understanding with great directness. Psalm 4 ends with the words, "I will both lie down in peace and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." Psalm 91 promised protection through the night, saying that those who trusted in God would not fear the terror of the night or the arrow that flies by day. These texts were not merely comforting words, but expressions of a coherent theological understanding of the relationship between the sleeping human being and the divine, and they were heard and said in the evening context of pre-electric households, with a regularity that made them as much a part of the bedtime routine as the warming of the bed or the putting on of the nightcap. The evening prayer was said at the bedside in many traditions, kneeling on the cold floor in whatever light remained, saying the words that had been said in the same posture in the same room, on the same cold floor every evening since childhood. The posture of kneeling, the physical submission of the body, was part of the prayer rather than merely its accompaniment, and the physical discomfort of the cold floor and the cold air was absorbed into the act of prayer without much complaint, because the prayer was a habit, and habits were not examined for their physical cost in the way that deliberate choices are examined. The Islamic tradition of the evening prayer The Isha prayer that was said after the sky had become fully dark similarly framed the transition towards sleep within a structure of religious obligation and of conscious relationship with the divine. The ablutions that preceded the prayer, the washing of face and hands and feet, were themselves a practical preparation for sleep that happened to also be a religious requirement, and the combination of the physical cleansing and the spiritual orientation of the prayer created a transition towards sleep that engaged both the body and the mind in the direction of rest and settledness. Across many religious traditions, the spoken acknowledgement of the end of the day and the commendation of the self to divine protection through the night served a function that was both theological and psychological, the articulation of trust in something larger than the self, the release of the day's accumulated concerns into a larger framework of meaning, the settling of the mind into the posture of receptivity that sleep requires. Chapter 25, The Return of Light and What It Meant. Having spent so long with the darkness, it is worth ending with the return of light, because the return of light in the pre-electric world had a quality and a meaning that the simple switch of an electric light at a predetermined alarm time does not replicate. The first light came before the sun, in the months near the equinoxes when the nights were not too long and the days not too short. The sky would begin to lighten an hour or more before the sun crested the horizon, a slow brightening from the deep dark of the hours after midnight toward a pale grey that was distinguishable from dark, only gradually, the eye having to adjust to recognize that something had changed. This first light was called the dawn, and the pre-electric world had a much more intimate relationship with it than the modern world does, because the pre-electric world was paying attention to it in a way that the modern world, with its alarm clocks and its artificial lights, generally is not. The dawn was the beginning of the working day for most people in most of the pre-electric world, and the relationship between rising and the dawn was direct and immediate. You rose when there was light enough to do what needed to be done, and there was light enough to do what needed to be done when the dawn came. This meant rising at times that varied considerably with the season, much earlier in summer when the dawn came at 4 or even earlier, much later in the depths of winter when the light did not come until 7 or 8. The variation in the hour of rising with the season was not a problem to be managed, but simply the way things were, and the body more accustomed to following natural light cues than the modern body is, adjusted to these variations with relative ease. The birds knew the light was coming before the human sleeper did. The dawn chorus, the singing of birds that began in the dark before the light was yet visible, was a feature of the pre-electric morning that was heard by anyone who was awake or who was lightly sleeping near a window or in a setting where the sound of the outside world entered the sleeping space. The dawn chorus is still there, of course, but the pre-electric person who had been sleeping in genuine darkness without sound pollution heard it with a clarity and a prominence that many modern people do not experience, and it was the natural alarm clock of the pre-electric world, the signal that the light was coming and that the day was about to begin. The returning light transformed the bedroom. The shutters, when they were opened, admitted not just light, but air, and the sounds of the morning and the room, that had been closed and dark and contained through the night became connected again with the world outside. The fire that had been low through the night and that had been revived in the early morning was adding its warmth to the warmth of the returning sun through the windows. The house was waking room by room, the darkness retreating as the light advanced, the contracted world of the night expanding again into the full-scale world of the day. This daily expansion of the world from the small and dark and warm of the night to the large and bright and active of the day, repeated every morning, was part of what the pre-electric person experienced as the rhythm of existence. The world went in every evening, and the world came out again every morning, and both movements were natural and regular and reliable, and the reliability was itself a form of comfort. Chapter 26. The Bedtime of Children. Across history. We mentioned children's bedtime briefly in an earlier chapter, but the bedtime of children across the various periods of the pre-electric world is interesting enough to deserve more extended treatment, because children's relationship with sleep and with bedtime was in some respects quite different from the adult relationship, and in other respects entirely the same. The very young child in any period goes to sleep when it needs to sleep, regardless of what the household is doing, and the management of the very young child's sleep was as much a challenge for pre-electric parents as for modern ones. The swaddling of infants, which was the practice of wrapping newborn babies tightly in cloth strips to restrict their movement, was standard across much of European and Middle Eastern history for many centuries, and one of its stated purposes was to help the baby sleep more deeply and to prevent it from startling itself awake with its own involuntary movements. Whether swaddling achieved this purpose is a question that has been debated, but the practice was widespread and long-lasting, which suggests that those who used it found it helpful. The cradle rocked. The cradle in the pre-electric household was typically a simple wooden construction, curved at the base so that it could be rocked, and the rocking of the cradle to soothe the restless infant was a continuous and repetitive activity that required the presence of a person to provide the rocking. The foot-rocked cradle, designed so that the person sitting nearby could rock it with their foot, while keeping their hands free for other work, was an efficient design that allowed the rocking of the baby and the spinning of wool or the mending of cloth to be done simultaneously. The slightly older child, past the stage of the cradle but not yet old enough to manage their own bedtime, was put to bed in the household standard way, which varied by period and by social position in the ways we have already discussed. The bedtime of this child might be marked by a prayer, or a short story, or a song. The lullaby is ancient, probably as ancient as the awareness that a drowsy infant responds to rhythm and voice in ways that wakefulness does not, and the lullabies that have been collected and recorded from various pre-electric cultures share certain qualities. They are rhythmic, they are repetitive, they are in a lower register than speaking voices, and they are calm in a way that suggests their function is clearly understood by those who sing them. The bedtime of older children in the pre-electric world was managed within the general pattern of the household, which, as we have noted, was shaped by the available light. In summer, when the light lasted late and the days were long and active, Children might be expected to go to bed while it was still light, the summer bedtime coming at an hour that felt arbitrary and premature to the child who could see daylight through the window. In winter, the early dark made the early bedtime more acceptable because the world outside was dark and there was nothing to do in a cold house by a fire that was already dying down. Chapter 27. The long history of this moment. We have spent a great deal of this evening with the people of the pre-electric world and their various bedtime routines, their fires and their candles and their nightcaps and their prayers and their bed warmers and their two-phase sleep and their lullabies and their dawn choruses. And we have been doing this, as we do these things, because the topic is exactly right for this hour. Specific enough to give the mind something to attend to, and gentle enough not to require urgent attention, historical enough to be safely distant and human enough to feel familiar. But there is also this, which is perhaps the most important thing. Every single person whose bedtime we have been considering in this story made it to the morning. Every medieval peasant who banked the fire and lay down on the straw pallet and pulled the rough blanket over them eventually woke to the light of another day. Every Georgian gentleman who extinguished his reading candle in his curtained bed eventually stirred to the sounds of the household beginning another morning. Every colonial settler who said the evening prayer in the cold bedroom and pulled on the nightcap and climbed into the warmed bed eventually heard the dawn chorus and rose to tend the fire and the animals. They all made it through the night, night after night after night. For all the centuries that we have been considering, the night came and was endured and was passed through and was left behind in the morning, and another day began, and life continued. The darkness did what darkness does, which is to hold the sleeping person safely through the hours that consciousness cannot manage, and the morning did what morning does, which is to return. The night is very good at this. It has had a great deal of practice. It has been doing this for as long as there have been nights, and as long as there have been people who needed to sleep through them, and it has not once failed to become morning in the end. You are in good hands. The darkness is here. Everything that needed to be done today has been done, or will wait until tomorrow when the morning comes and it can be done in the light. The fire is banked, the candle is out, the bed is warm, the nightcap is on, or its equivalent, whatever it is in your life that signals to you that the day is definitively over and the night is definitively here. The church bell has rung its last ring of the evening. The house is quiet. The dawn chorus is hours away. Between now and then, there is only this, the dark and the warmth, and the slow, patient, ancient business of sleep. It has been waiting for you. Go to it now. Good night. Extended reflections on the smell of the pre-electric night. For those who are still present at this late hour, which means either that the story has not yet done its work, or that you are reading it for reasons other than the one it was written for. Here are some further thoughts on the pre-electric night. This time approached through the sense of smell rather than the sense of sight, because the pre-electric night had its own specific smell that is worth trying to imagine. The smell of the pre-electric household in the evening was predominantly the smell of fire, wood smoke or peat smoke or coal smoke, depending on the fuel available, permeated the rooms of the house and the clothing and hair of the people who lived in them, in the way that any smell permeates a space in which it is always present. The people who lived in these houses did not notice this smell in the way that a visitor from outside would notice it, for the same reason that you do not notice the smell of your own home unless you have been away from it for a while and come back with an outsider's nose. The smoke smell was simply the smell of the house, of all houses, of every interior space where fires burned. The tallow candle added its own note to the evening smell, the fatty, slightly rancid smell of rendered animal fat burning in a wick, distinctive and not particularly pleasant by modern standards, but entirely familiar and unremarkable by the standards of the people who burn tallow candles every evening. The beeswax candle that wealthy households used had a much more pleasant smell, warm and honey-sweet, the smell of the wax itself being agreeable even when warm, and the burning adding only the clean smell of combustion without the fatty undertone of tallow. The straw of the mattress had a smell, the dry grass smell of stored straw that was pleasantest when the straw was fresh and became less pleasant as it absorbed the warmth and moisture of the sleeper over months of use. The annual changing of the straw in summer was an operation that improved the smell of the sleeping space significantly, and a freshly stuffed straw mattress had a quality of freshness that the accumulated months of use gradually reduced. The herbs that were sometimes scattered among the bedding or dried and hung in the sleeping space added pleasant notes to the bedroom smell. Lavender was used for its pleasant fragrance and its reputation as a promoter of sleep, and the smell of lavender in a bedroom is one that has retained its association with sleep into the present day, which tells us something about the persistence of sensory associations across great changes in everything else. Dried roses and sweet herbs served similar functions, and the care with which these were managed was part of the attention to the sleeping space that the people of the pre-electric world paid. The smell of the night air outside where it entered the bedroom through imperfect windows or under doors varied enormously by season and location. The fresh, cold smell of a winter night, the smell of rain entering with the wind, the smell of hay drying in the fields in summer, the smell of the town in summer, which was not always pleasant, and the smell of the countryside, which more often was. The sleeper in a bedroom with a window open to the garden on a summer night had a different relationship with the outdoor smell than the sleeper in a sealed winter bedroom with the shutters firmly closed against the cold. All of these smells were part of the texture of the pre-electric night, as the sounds were part of it, and the darkness was part of it, and the physical warmth of the bed was part of it. The pre-electric person going to sleep was embedded in this texture of smell and sound and warmth and dark, and the texture was familiar because it was the same every night, and the familiarity was itself part of what made it conducive to sleep. We cannot recreate this texture exactly. The smells of our bedrooms are different. The sounds are different. The darkness is different. But the essential requirements of sleep are the same, and the body's response to the conditions for sleep, when those conditions are present, is the same, and the sleep that comes is the same sleep that has always come at the end of days that were long enough, and evenings that were quiet enough, and nights that were dark enough. Your bedroom is quiet enough. Your night is dark enough. Your day was long enough. Let the texture of this moment, whatever it is, be sufficient. It is sufficient. The candle is out. Sleep now. The embers in the hearth settle into themselves, quietly, without urgency. The tallow candle has burned down to nothing, and its last small thread of smoke has risen and been absorbed into the dark. The nightcap is warm. The curtains are drawn. The second sleep, when it comes, will be the deepest sleep, the sleep in which the body restores what the day has taken from it, the sleep that the pre-electric world knew well, and that is available to you now, here, in the quiet of this particular night, which is yours and which is enough and which asks nothing of you except to stop holding on to things and to let the dark be what it is, which is the other half of the day, the half that belongs to rest, the half that has always been waiting for the tired person to arrive and to stay for a while and to be held without effort until the morning. The fire is very low now. The house is dark from the front door to the back, from the kitchen to the bedrooms, from the ground floor to the attic where the stored apples smell faintly of autumn, and the dried herbs hang from the beams in neat bundles. Everything is still. Everything is as it should be at this hour. The long day is behind you. The long night is here. The morning is already on its way, somewhere beyond the dark, patient and unhurried, coming as it has always come, and in the meantime the dark holds everything gently and without effort, and you are held in it, and you are warm, and you are still, and you are almost entirely asleep. Good night. The rushlight is spent. The night watch has passed. The church clock has rung its last ring of the evening. The second sleep is here for those who want it, and the first sleep is here for those who have not yet had it, and both of them are the same sleep in the end, the same old, reliable dark rest that the body knows how to take when everything is still and quiet, and the day is truly finished. This is that moment. This is exactly that moment. Sleep well. The candle is out. The fire is banked. The night is here. Good night.